what's actually happening in practice. So what you often have is where you have the most amount of friction is you have the application developers and so forth kind of delivering new building new things, and then because the pre-production environment and the test environment isn't secure, when they go into the production environment, nothing works. Right? Has anyone been in that situation where you've seen things kind of go into production and fail spectacularly? Does that kind of resonate with you at all? So, in order to make these things work, right, you have to bring out the crowbar and the sledgehammer and say, all right, now you got to make production look as insecure as pre-production, right? So now operations is undoing everything. Well, actually, it's now you're undoing everything that you might have done to make production secure. And all these last-minute changes that you're making to make these things work are never really documented, right? And then, by the way, this is what catches the auditor's attention, and that's when you start generating audit findings, which causes a whole bunch of urgency in fixing those, and creates more unplanned work, right? And you're not actually fixing root cause. And this is actually what causes a downward spiral that we've modeled. So the consequence of this is that access is not controlled, right? You're having to let developers into the production environment. So your perfect access controls that you've set up in production are now undone. Resources are wasted. People are in reactive mode. Changes are not being documented. Compliance starts piling on, right? And you end up with these very undesirable effects that happen, right? So this is bad for security, also bad for operations as well. So, kind of going into that, is it true? That what we observe in the high performers is that, hey, what's good for operations is good for security, and what's good for security is good for operations. Is it true that, hey, if IT operations achieve its goals, one of the natural byproducts is good security as well? And so we kind of went back to first principles, and maybe to make these a little bit more focused, kind of the question that we were seeking to answer was, what are those subset of controls that also helps operational objectives as well, as opposed to ones that are viewed as irrelevant objectives that are just purely cost or bureaucracy, right? What controls are the most effective and efficient? What controls have the highest rate of return? How do you measure, performance, right? What is the link between controls and performance? How do you prove that, internal rate of return or return on investment of good controls, right? So these are things that we felt didn't have really good answers. And we wanted to prove that, hey, there's a common set of problems that if you focus on, you will simultaneously, solve operational objectives as well as security objectives simultaneously. So the trick is, what are those and how do you measure it? So just to kind of frame our inspiration and our thought process, one of the cues, the methodology that we really wanted to replicate was a group of MIT researchers who benchmarked almost every major automotive manufacturing plant in the 1980s, and they basically found that when they did the benchmarking, certain manufacturing plants had 1/2 the defects, 1/2 the floor space, 1/2 the work in process, 1/2 the cycle time, 1/2 the inventory. They said, those are the high performers, right? Let's go out and capture and codify what they did. And they turned that into a body of knowledge called lean manufacturing. Right? So how many people here have heard of lean manufacturing? How about Deming, Dr. Deming and TQM? Okay. How about Dr. Goldratt and theory of constraints? Okay, so Deming, it sounds like, is the most... so between Dr. Deming, Dr. Goldratt, and the lean manufacturing people, those were kind of considered the three primary fathers of the manufacturing movement. Right? And... in fact, if you take a look at the quotes around General Motors and Ford, kind of the people that are being quoted is this guy, Dr. Womack. So he's at MIT at the Center for Automotive Research, or some clever acronym. But those are the people who invented lean manufacturing. So Dr. Goldratt, he said something kind of interesting. When he was kind of working on his work called theory of constraints. He said, in any field of science, there are really three distinct phases: classification, correlation, and causation. Classification is sort of like earth, air, fire, water. We're just labeling things, right? We're kind of just trying to figure out what's different, right? And maybe kind of labeling them. But one of the big one of the things that causes a breakthrough in science, right, is when you can get to correlation, right? Saying, some chemicals, if I eat, are tasty and nutritious. Some of them are lethal, right? It's good to know the difference between the two. And in the physical sciences, the real breakthrough was in the periodic table. That said, hey, all the elements that are on the left-hand side of the periodic table, when you throw them into water, have wildly exothermic reactions, right? Lithium, sodium, potassium. What's below potassium? Yeah. Anyway, so that left-hand thing, right? And so once you identify that, right, you say, oh, it's the outer electron shell that dominates, the physical attributes and the reactivity, and that's what gets you to causation, right? That comes to a causative model. So kind of our claim is that, where are we in IT? We're sort of in this classification phase, right? We're sort of labeling things and, ITIL and COBIT. But what we really don't know is, how does controls relate to performance, right? How does controls relate to the achievement of the goals, right? Which ones are the most important? How do you measure that? So that's kind of what we set out to do. And causation is kind of what we try to achieve in the visible ops methodology. So part of our goal was to get to causation, correlation, so we can eventually get to causation. How am I doing so far? Is this, can you give me a thumbs up saying, Gene, I'm tracking with you? Thumbs down means I'm just trying to stay awake. Thumbs up? Okay. All right, so so science is made up of two parts, theory building and theory testing, right? And so what I found is that in IT and maybe even IT security more than any other place in IT is we're very good at building theories, but we're not as good at testing theories from an operational perspective. And so what are the specific theories that we're trying to test? Well, there are three things that we observed in the high performers that we looking back, we knew there was something different about these organizations because you could tell in a 15-minute phone call that there's something really different about these folks. It took us many more years to come up with a concrete language for it, but here's what they are. One is they all had a culture of change management, meaning, if you ask the organization, how do you make changes around here? They wouldn't say you just log into it and make a change. They would all universally say, you have to go to some sort of governing body and ask. And if you can't get authorization, you can't make the change, right? And when you kind of suggest, hey, isn't change management bureaucratic? Doesn't it slow things down? Doesn't it suck the will to live out of everybody it touches? They'll say, no. We do over 1,000 successful production changes a week with a change success rate of over 99%, right? That's not slow. That's really fast. So they're like, interesting. The second thing that we found was they all had a culture of causality. Meaning that, actually, what's the best illustration of this? Microsoft, they did a study of their best customers as part of their ITIL professional services offering. And they found that their best customers rebooted their servers 20 times less often than their average customers and also had 5 times fewer blue screens of death, right? Same technology, probably same type of people, right? And yet we're getting profoundly different, results out of, their offerings. And so this very much matched what we found in our high performers in that, whenever you ask a high performer, where do outages and service impairments and security breaches come from? They'll say change. 80% of these issues come from change, and 80% of mean time to repair is trying to figure out what changed. So where do you suppose high performers look first when things go wrong? What changed? Exactly. Right. So quantitatively, how do you measure that? You end up with lower mean time to repair, right? Higher mean times between failure. But one of my favorite metrics is first fix rate. What percentage of fixes work the first time, right? Do you see how blindly rebooting servers brings down first fix rate, and looking at change first increases first fix rate? Does that make sense? Does anyone have a friend who kind of is known to sort of fix things just by rebooting? Right. I mean, it's good for laptops, terrible for mission-critical infrastructure, right? So what we found is high performers typically have a first fix rate of over 90%. And Microsoft said that, in their worst customers is 20 times less than that. We found it's probably around 50%. The third thing that we found was that all of the high performers have a culture of, let's call it planned work. Right? It's the difference between a low fuel light on a car and 6 guys running down the highway with gas cans. Right? I mean, but they both get the job done, right? But they're profoundly different ways of working. In the first case, you can fix it next week with less urgency and less staff, right? You can do it with one person. In the second case, you don't have a choice. You have a security incident, you have a mission-critical outage or a service impairment. You have to mobilize everybody to get the thing working again, right? So, the first case is